Sahana vavatu, Sahana bhunaktu, Sahaviryam karvavahe, Tejasvi navaditamastu, Ma vidvishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Welcome to the Yoga Anatomy DVD series. I've often pondered the question, why would I need to know anatomy in order to do yoga poses? And sometimes I come to the answer that I don't need to, and I've even questioned going around teaching. And I've also thought about it further and realized that anatomy actually adds an interesting layer of understanding onto an existing yoga practice. In the same way, or at least in a similar way, if you study Ayurveda, if you study the scriptures like Patanjali Yoga Sutras, you wouldn't necessarily apply them directly to each asana or pose, but in an overall sense, it adds a certain quality and certain elements into the practice that you're doing. It creates a breadth of knowledge for you to use your practice in and for. And so anatomy certainly doesn't take the place or equal Yoga Sutras, but with so many people doing an asana practice, so many people doing yoga postures, understanding anatomy may help you to deepen your understanding of the benefits that you're getting in your yoga practice. Now, I come as a yoga practitioner, not just as an anatomy teacher. Nothing can replace experience in doing a regular practice. Anatomy is not meant to do that. And for my purposes, this DVD is not about creating perfect alignment, assuming that even exists. And it's also not about creating yet another style of yoga. I'm not about that at all. Instead, what I want to do is create a foundation for you to understand anatomy and continue understanding anatomy, to read books that you may already have sitting on your shelf, so that you can understand what's going on and again feed that back into your body and your actual experience of doing yoga. If you're a yoga teacher and watching this, this information will be directly applicable to the classes you teach. Not in the sense that you need to name anatomical parts or areas of the body for your students, because they probably won't understand them anyway. However, by the end of this DVD series, you should be able to see anatomy in a different way. You should be able to observe your students with more information backing you up, and therefore influencing the decisions that you make in how you work with particular students. In this first DVD, we're covering some of the fundamental information to anatomy. That is, basic movements, directional terms, naming of bones and joints and other structures in the body, as well as covering the skeletal system, the muscular system, connective tissue, and the nervous system. This first section of it is actually important for us to create a little bit of a language, a little bit of foundation for us to have conversations that are more specific and more clear about anatomy. Directional terms are important to us because they allow us to create specific words to talk about specific areas of the body or structures in the body. And the more clear we can be about those structures and where they're located, the more intelligent our conversation becomes. And they're based on what's called anatomical position in the West. An anatomical position in the West is a person standing, facing forward, palms are forward, feet slightly apart. So anytime we use these terms, we're going to imagine that the person is in anatomical position if they're not. So, the first two words are medial and lateral. They're based off of an imaginary line that bisects the body. Any area or structure closer to that midline on either side of the body is considered more medial. For instance, the inner surface of my arm is medial, whether it's the right arm or the left arm. The outer surface of the arm is considered lateral. Let's get just a little more specific. We'll look at this on a bone. Here's the humerus. This is the medial surface of the humerus. This is the lateral surface of the humerus. There are two bones in the forearm. This is the medial bone, the lateral bone. Just that simple. Distal and proximal are the next two terms I'm going to describe to you. And the reference point for these is the head. We use these two terms on the extremities of the body. That is, either the legs or the arms. Distal refers to distance. So if it has more distance, it's the distal part of whatever that structure is. If it's closer to my head, it has more proximity to my head. If we look at the end of the femur, this is the distal end of the femur, it meets with the proximal end of the tibia to make the knee joint. The next two terms I want to introduce you to are anterior and posterior. Very simple terms. Most people are familiar with them already. Anterior means in front of, posterior means behind. So if we look at our femur one more time, the front of the femur is the anterior surface of the femur. The part in the back is the posterior surface of the femur. If we're going to describe the posterior surface of the femur or of the leg, it's always going to be as if it's in anatomical position. Now there's two more terms I want to give you. They are superior and inferior. Let me grab my spine. These two vertebrae. This is the first lumbar vertebrae, also known as L1. Above it is the last thoracic vertebrae, known as T12. T12 is superior to L1, or you could say L1 is inferior to T12. So we normally use superior and inferior on what's called the axial skeleton. That is the central part of the body, which includes the spine, the pelvis, and the rib cage. In the basic movement section, we specifically talk about movements relative to anatomical position. This information is valuable to you because if you want to deconstruct a pose, you have to look at it from its basic movements. And from those basic movements, then you understand what tissues are creating that movement or restricting that movement. Now, there is a long list of movements in the body. At particular joints, you get some very specific names. So I bring them back to just basic movements. And those are flexion extension, abduction adduction, and rotation. So the first two terms are flexion and extension. Now the important thing to remember about flexion and extension is that it's a forward and backward movement. So we're going to define these two words. Flexion is defined as decreasing the angle of a joint. So I'm going to grab an arm. For argument's sake, we'll call this a straight line 180 degrees. So again, flexion is defined as decreasing the angle of a joint. So as I bend the elbow, I am flexing it. So I've gone from 180 degrees to 90 degrees. And from 90 degrees, I'm going to go to 45 degrees, and so on. So that is flexion of the elbow. Extension is the exact opposite. Extension is increasing the angle of a joint. So I'm going from 0 degrees to 45 to 90 degrees back to 180 degrees. Okay, so here it is on my own body. Okay, I'll put them together. Flexion of the elbow, extension of the elbow. Flexion of the shoulder, extension of the shoulder. Okay? If I start to flex every joint in my body, or as many as I can, remember forward and backward movements, I'm going to start with my fingertips, flexing the fingertips, the wrist, the elbows. Here's the shoulder. Now I'm going to add in my neck, my spine, my hip joints, my knee joints, and even the ankles, until I basically end up in a little ball. So if I'm going to extend, I'm going to end up coming right back up into anatomical position. So you could look at flexion and extension as a movement out of or away from anatomical position, and extension as a return to anatomical position. And if we think about it that way, I'm going to add in one more word, which is hyperextension. Hyperextension is not only a condition. And what I mean by that is people talk about hyperextended knees or hyperextended elbows that bend too much. It's talked about a lot in yoga. That's as a condition. But hyperextension is also a normal and natural movement. So if we look at flexion as a movement out of anatomical position forward, and extension as a return to anatomical position, hyper just means an excess of. So an excess of extension. So here's hyperextension of the shoulder joint. Back to anatomical position. Just one more example of flexion, extension, hyperextension. If we look at the spine, here's flexion of the spine. Extension of the spine is back to anatomical position. And hyperextension is any type of back-bending movement. It's normal and natural. We do it all the time. The next two movements I want to introduce you to are abduction and adduction. Flexion, extension went forward and backwards. Abduction and adduction go sideways, like jumping jacks. So if we go back to that imaginary line that divided my body in the directional terms, for movement, if I move a limb away from that line, like at my shoulder joint, this is considered to be abduction of the shoulder. As I bring it back to my body, I'm doing adduction of the shoulder. The last basic movement is rotation. And rotation is a twisting or a turning action. Flexion, extension went forward and backwards. Abduction, adduction went sideways. And rotation stays parallel to the plane of the ground, of the floor. So I'm going to do rotation of the hip joint. If you get a close-up of my foot, you'll see that the foot slides along the plane of the floor. It stays parallel to the floor as rotation happens. The same thing is true if we come back up and we look at my shoulder joint. I'm gonna bend my elbow 90 degrees just because this will give you the reference to the plane. We might just lift that floor up to the arm for a moment. So if I rotate at the shoulder joint, my forearm goes for the ride. So this is external rotation, this is internal rotation of the shoulder. And you'll notice that the forearm stays parallel to the floor. Okay, quick recap. Flexion and extension, forward and backward movements. Abduction and adduction are sideways movements. Rotation is a turning or a twisting that happens along the plane of the floor. So when we take these pieces of basic movements, the way to use this as a teacher or a practitioner is to understand what muscles make you do a particular action. And if you know that, then you know that the opposite muscles, the opposing muscles to that, are the ones that are going to lengthen. Let's break down a simple movement that we do, or posture that we do regularly, and that is hands being in prayer position, or namaste. So I'm going to go back to anatomical position for a moment, and we're going to put this together piece by piece. So from anatomical position, if I bend my elbows, flexion of the elbows, internal rotation at the shoulder joints, I'm going to rotate just the forearms and then bring my hands and wrist into a hyperextended position, and I end up in prayer position. If I flex the hip joint, let's say I know that my psoas, my quadriceps, and my adductors and a few other hip flexors make me flex my hip joint. That means that the exact opposite muscles, the hamstrings, the gluteals, are all being lengthened as I do this. This is where the bits of information, understanding the basic movements, knowing a little bit about the muscles and where they're located, becomes very practical. So if I go into a forward bend, my hip flexors aren't going to restrict me. My hip extenders, because I'm flexing the hip joints, my hip extenders, primarily hamstrings and gluteals, are going to be what restricts me. So if I bring that back up, and we look at another pose, for instance, if I do a standing half lotus, If I have trouble bringing this leg up and in, it means that the rotators, if I'm doing external rotation of the hip joint, it means that the internal rotators are the ones that need to lengthen, which includes adductors and a couple of the gluteal muscles. So if we know what action we're doing, the opposite action and the muscles that make that happen are the ones that are being lengthened. Now, as good as these flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction is, it's basic x, y, and z coordinates that are made up by scientists in the past. Nobody moves from anatomical position, and they definitely don't always return to anatomical position, although in yoga we do sometimes come back to samastitihi or tadasana. So they only have so much value. So for instance, this is named flexion, and I'll return to anatomical position. And if I go to the side, this is named abduction. But if I go at a 45-degree angle between those two, out here in the middle, that's not even named. There's no name for that other than a functional plane of movement. And so these names just give us a reference point from anatomical position, and that's their only value. In this next segment, what I want to do is break down some anatomical words. Specifically, I'm going to teach you how to name any joint in the body. And this formula that I'm going to give you also applies to other structures, common structures in the body. And it's actually really simple. To name any joint, this is what I call the algebraic equation. Bone, the name of the bone, plus an O, plus the next bone. Now we do have to make a little bit of change to the endings of the first bone or the last bone, but it's pretty simple. So let's name the knee joint. So the knee joint is a combination of the femur and the tibia. So here we are on the distal end of the femur meeting up with the proximal end of the tibia. Femur plus O plus tibia makes femorotibia. And if we really stretch it out, add an L to the ending of the second bone, femorotibial joint is the name of this joint. It's that simple. Femorotibial joint. Let's name the elbow joint. This is the humerus. It meets with the medial bone of the forearm, that is the bone on the inside of the forearm. This is humerus plus O plus ulna, humero-ulnar joint. And this is where flexion and extension occurs. Now we could go the other way. Let me give you a couple of names or words that you might have heard that use this same algebraic formula.
Musculoskeletal is muscle plus O plus skeletal and refers to the combination of these two systems when they work together. Neurovascular. Neuro refers to nerves and vascular to blood supply. Together they create what we call a neurovascular bundle, which is a bundle of arteries, veins, and nerves that feed an area of the body. Iliotibial. Ilio refers to the ilium, a bone on the pelvis, and tibial obviously refers to the tibia. And the iliotibial band is a band of connective tissue that runs down the side of the leg and connects the pelvis to the foreleg for knee stability.
All right, let's bring a number of these terms together in two particular joints. We're going to look at the forearm here. We just named the humero-ulnar joint, and we've got two bones in the forearm. This is the medial bone, that's the ulna, on the inside, and on the outside of the forearm is the radius. These two bones come together in two places, and wherever two bones come together is what we call a joint, or articulation. So first we want to name these two joints. Radius plus O plus ulna gives us, didn't hear that, radio-ulnar joint. So you've got a radio-ulnar joint here, and you've got a radio-ulnar joint here. So we've got to take two more words that we just learned and apply it to these two so we can differentiate them. What are those two words? distal and proximal. This is the distal radio-ulnar joint. This is the proximal radio-ulnar joint. What movement happens at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints? Rotation. In the next section, what we're going to talk about are what I consider to be the four components that allow or restrict movement in the body. And that is the skeletal system, connective tissue, the muscular system, and the nervous system. These four components work together at all times. Now, as we go through them, we're going to separate them. We're going to talk about each one of those segments separately. And this is a big problem with really, truly understanding anatomy, is that in order to understand it, we divide it up so that we can explain the bits, but it very rarely gets put back together. And so we really want to hold on to how all of these elements work together, how they all fit together, because really, at the end of the day, it's one unit. It's one system that we have arbitrarily divided into segments. So first we're going to talk about the skeletal system, and it has 5 basic functions. The first one, protection. I come with my own crash helmet. It protects my brain and his, although, yeah, his is empty. You've got the heart and the lungs surrounded by the rib cage for protection. The second function of the skeletal system is storage of minerals. And so within the bones, we keep calcium, salts, phosphate, and some phosphorus rather, and some other minerals that come out of the bones when needed in the body and get put back into the bones when there's enough floating around in the body. Creation of red blood cells also happens in the bones of the body. Before adolescence, they happen in what are called the long bones of the body, like the femur and the tibia below. And as we age, it comes into the flat bones, like the pelvis. And so red blood cell production happens here in the pelvis. Structure is the fourth function of the skeletal system. And by structure, basically, we've got this rough framework that allows for muscles to attach onto. And by the way, if you ever see an image in an anatomy book, the red and the blue here is referring to muscle origins and insertions. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And the last function is the one that we're most concerned with, which is movement. And movement happens wherever two bones come together, which are joints, which is what we've been just naming a moment ago. Joints come together in 3 ways. The first is a very ligamentous, fibrous type of connection, and there's not very much movement at this type of joint. For instance, the suture lines of the skull. The skull is a total of 26 bones coming together, and where they merge together, particularly in the flatter areas, the bones are held together with a very thick, fibrous, ligamentous type material. So not a lot of movement there. The second type of connection that we have for joints is a cartilaginous connection. Cartilaginous connection happens here in the rib cage where the ribs meet the sternum. Every single rib attaches to the breastbone or the sternum via cartilage. None of them connect directly bone to bone. They only come together with cartilage. Here in the spine, all of the vertebrae are connected to one another through the discs of the spine. So that's another cartilaginous connection. Each disc is basically a piece of cartilage. Another cartilaginous connection here at the pubic bone in the front of the pelvis. Each side of the pelvis is connected via a piece of cartilage. Okay, so these are all considered to be semi-movable. As we breathe, the ribs expand, move outward and upward. Obviously, we can bend our spine, so movement is possible at cartilaginous connections. The last type are synovial connections. And so the synovial joints are the most abundant in the body, and they're also the most movable. The elbow joint, the 2 radio-ulnar joints that we just described, all of the joints in the hand, all synovial joints. And so they all have the same components. And those components are a joint capsule, which literally encapsulates the ends of those two bones as they come together. It basically cuts it off from the rest of the body. Yeah? Blood supply and nerve supply can go in and out of it. The next component, just on the inside of the joint capsule, is a synovial membrane. And the synovial membrane produces what's called synovial fluid. And synovial fluid is the lubricant, the carrier medium for minerals and nutrients. And it works very closely with what's called hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage. And if you've ever seen the end of a chicken bone with that white or glossy, almost translucent cap to it, that's articular cartilage. Very smooth, very slick surface. And when you join that together with synovial fluid, you get almost frictionless action and movement at that joint, assuming that it's healthy, of course. So for instance, I usually use the ankle joint as an example of that. And so if you think about your ankle joint for a moment, both of them are handling all of your weight. And I can move at my ankle joint, lift it, move it, if I walk or run. If my joint is healthy, I don't notice it. I don't feel it grinding or crackling or doing anything, and it's got all of that weight going through it. So in a healthy joint, you feel almost no friction. And that's a result of the smoothness of the hyaline cartilage and the lubrication from the synovial fluid. So the second component of movement that we're going to talk about is connective tissue. And connective tissue is actually the most dynamic of all of these structures in that it links the skeletal system to the muscular system. It is the in-between stuff. So what people don't realize about connective tissue is that it actually shows up in various forms. For instance, a tendon, which is the end of a muscle, as it connects to a bone, is a piece of connective tissue. Ligaments are another type of connective tissue. And ligaments connect one bone to another bone, allowing for and restricting movement around that joint. Scar tissue is another type of connective tissue. And scar tissue comes about when there's any kind of tear or injury to an area or part of the body that uses connective tissue. Bones are actually another type of connective tissue. And so they have a wrapping around them and inside of them, and that wrapping basically gets filled with specialized bone cells to make it into a bone. Muscles are the same thing. You get muscle cells wrapped in connective tissue and then bundled together and then bundled together again, and we're going to talk about that when we talk about the muscular system next. Fascia, which is a word that is often substituted for the word connective tissue, but is really just a type of connective tissue. And it's a type of connective tissue that you find when it's wrapped around a muscle. And the last type is cartilage. Even cartilage is connective tissue. It's filled in with specialized cells called chondrocytes that make it into a piece of cartilage. So what you come to find out, if you look at everything closely, is that just about everything, even arteries and veins and nerves, use connective tissue to hold themselves together. Everything in the body has basically formed out of connective tissue. And so as a substance in the body, it literally does what its name says, which connects things together. It's kind of the in-between stuff. It's what links everything together. In fact, you can go from any one place in your body to any other place in your body without ever leaving connective tissue. And so what is connective tissue made out of? Well, it's made out of two proteins, collagen and elastin. Collagen is a strong protein. That is, it's a very strong, stable structure. Elastin is elastic, as the name implies, and so there's more flexibility. So connective tissue gets formed into sheets, layers, or bands in order to serve different functions within the body. So if we look at a couple of specific structures made out of connective tissue, we'll look at the proportion of collagen to elastin. So for instance, if we look at a tendon, which is the end of a muscle that becomes connective tissue and then connects to bone, it's made up of primarily collagen. And it's made up primarily of collagen so that it has the strength of the collagen. Ligaments are made up in a similar way. Primarily collagen, connects one bone to another bone, and binds them together, allows them to move, and also restricts movement. So both of those have a high proportion of collagen. When connective tissue is in the form of fascia, however, when it's surrounding a muscle, it has a much higher proportion of elastin to collagen. And as a result, it has more flexibility. It's more elastic. And so we're able to stretch and lengthen muscles and then return them and contract them. All the while, the connective tissue surrounding that muscle is stretching and coming back to that neutral or normal space. So what I want to do is I want to connect these pieces together. And so if we look at a bone closely, what we find is on the outer surface of that bone is a layer of connective tissue. And so when we have a tendon coming in from a muscle, any muscle, connecting to that bone, the connective tissue of the tendon meshes and weaves itself together with the connective tissue that surrounds the bone. There's no line, there's no demarcation line of the beginning of one or the end of the other. It's one unit at that point. That muscle is completely connected to that bone. Nobody glues it on or sticks it on with Velcro or anything like that. And so after that tendon is weaved into the bone, as it heads off and starts to become a muscle, the proportion of collagen and elastin eventually begins to change. And you get a higher proportion of elastin in the connective tissue, which is what makes it fascia. Then it becomes the muscle and the muscle belly, and eventually it gets to the other end, where it starts to become a tendon again, become more fibrous and more proportion of collagen so that it has the strength to then weave itself into another bone. And so basically you've gone from connective tissue on the bone, stayed connective tissue through the tendon, through the fascia, until you got to tendon and to the next bone. And so it becomes one functional unit. As a result, connective tissue is intimately linked to flexibility. The health and flexibility of your connective tissue becomes a very important factor. So, what makes connective tissue tight? There are a number of things that come together to make that happen. Overuse of muscle, for instance, can create bindings within the connective tissue. As you overuse a muscle in a particular way, what you find is the muscle itself gets tighter and connective tissue adapts to that amount of tension. And so it becomes harder to then lengthen that connective tissue. The exact opposite, lack of use. When there's a lack of use in the tissues, connective tissue also starts to bind because it's never stretched or lengthened or pushed to its edge of flexibility, and as a result, it also starts to tighten. And when we look at connective tissue as it wraps around a muscle, it's also going to separate different segments of muscle. And so if there's no use of that muscle, a lack of use, then those layers of connective tissue actually get bound together. The body sees there's no movement, so those structures basically just start to, in a sense, grow together. And you can actually lose fine movements as a result of that. Injury is another way in which we lose flexibility in our connective tissue. And when we talk about tearing a muscle, for instance, let's say a lot of people say they've torn a hamstring. What they've really torn is the connective tissue, the fascia within that muscle. When connective tissue tears and starts to become repaired, the same elements come to that area, and this happens within about 30 minutes, called fibroblasts. And what it does is it starts to lay down new connective tissue over where that tear is. And when it does it in a crisscrossing fashion. When this happens, it starts to pull together the connective tissue from around that area. And this can create an adhesion or a restriction to movement in that particular area. And what we actually want to do in these situations is to continue to stretch that tissue while it's repairing. And what this does is it allows that connective tissue, as it's being laid down, to be more in line with the general structure of the muscle. In the case of a severe tear to muscle tissue, what you'll find is swelling and bruising in that area of the body. And of course, if anything like that happens, you should seek medical attention. But if you have a small or a minor tear, stretching after that tear is actually recommended. Of course, you wouldn't stretch to the same degree that caused the injury to happen, but a small amount of movement actually lengthens the scar tissue as it begins to heal and helps prevent a buildup, an overproduction of scar tissue, which would then create restrictions later on. So let me give you an example of connective tissue and an area where maybe there's an adhesion in it. If you look at my t-shirt and you think about it as a layer of connective tissue, covering the pectoralis muscles and the abdominal muscles, if I grab hold of it up here and I just give a little bit of a twist to it and a little tug, you can see these lines created in the shirt. And this is how connective tissue is as a sheet. And so just this little twist, moving maybe a quarter of an inch, half an inch around, creates these lines of tension. And those lines of tension will actually start to pull my shoulder towards that hip in the direction of those lines of tension. If I let that go, you'll notice there's no more lines of tension. We all have these in different areas of our body. And these come sometimes, as I said earlier, from injuries or overuse or lack of use in a particular area of the body. And there's a wonderful model that's created to describe this idea of how things get interconnected through tension in the body. And it's called tensegrity. Now, tensegrity is made up of two words, tension and integrity. This is a tensegrity model. And in this case, it's made up of two different components. We have a compressionary member, in this case, these red wood dowels, and these elastic bands. Now, tensegrity was popularized by a man named Buckminster Fuller, who was a designer and an architect and an engineer in the late 50s. He didn't invent it. He said, more or less, he discovered it happening in nature. And so what this model shows is that the compressionary members, these wood dowels, are suspended in a sea of tension created by these elastic bands. So if I push on one of these compressionary members, you can see that the rest of the structure also changes and adapts to the pressure that I place on that compressionary member. If I change the tension in one of the rubber bands, you'll see that compressionary members move. And as a result, the tensional members surrounding it also have to adapt. This is more or less how we're made. If you looked at our skeleton, you would notice that there are actually spaces between our bones where they come together. And so what holds our bones together in tension is connective tissue, whether it shows up as tendon, ligament, or fascia. Those elements, all of those elements, basically suspend our bones in space. So if you think about connective tissue and you're wondering, well, if it's that important and it's that intimately related to flexibility, how do we change it? Well, sometimes it's difficult because it's genetics to some degree. You might be naturally tight as a result of your genetic lineage, right? What you've gotten from your parents, you got. And some people might be a little bit more on the tight connective tissue side. Some people may be very on the loose side of connective tissue. Some people can do yoga poses without ever having tried. Some people, it takes years to be able to do yoga poses because they've got to lengthen their connective tissue. So what can you do to change your connective tissue? Well, connective tissue changes with temperature. This is why when you go to bed, you wake up in the morning, you're always stiffer in the morning. Why? Because you haven't been moving, your body temperature has dropped, and the connective tissue has tightened up a little bit. By the end of the day, you're much more flexible than you were when you began the day, because you've been moving around, the sun's hopefully come out, and you've gotten warmer. So in your own body, you can also change temperature. And this can change from two things. One, by putting pressure on those tissues. If either I directly place pressure on the tissues, and there are whole modalities of body work, that is like massage therapy. And I'm specifically thinking about Rolfing. which is a whole nother subject, but it's a type of body work where the entire intention is to put pressure and force on the connective tissues of the body. And when force and pressure goes onto it, it starts to change. The temperature increases within that structure, and as a result, it starts to lengthen. Yoga is a perfect way to heat your body and lengthen and stretch connective tissue, because as you start to pull your bones apart from each other, the tension is created within the connective tissue and it starts to spread apart, lengthen, and warm. So connective tissue, as I've already said, binds everything together. It does exactly what it says, connects things together. It's also on the subtle side. I mentioned that it's the in-between stuff in the body. It connects everything together. It's kind of the ethereal structure in the body by binding everything together. And if there's going to be any one place that energy moves through the body or gets stuck in the body, chances are it's connective tissue. And I can't prove that to you. That's just a sense from body work that I've done myself and experiences that I've had in my own body, is that connective tissue holds that subtle quality in the body. Let's move on to the third component that deals with movement, and that is the muscular system. Now, first thing we need to do is redefine what is a muscle. And I'm going to change your idea of what you think a muscle is, because so far we've been talking about it separately, or you've been reading about it and hearing about it separately. A muscle is actually connective tissue with specialized cells within it, and that is, those cells are actually two more types of protein called actin and myosin. Don't worry about holding on to the names and those words. You can look those up in any anatomy book. What's important is that you understand how a muscle is structured, and it's basically structured with connective tissue. If we go down to a cellular level, what we find is actin and myosin are lined up in a long row. And when the nervous system comes in and stimulates that muscle, calcium is actually released onto that cell. Now, this is getting technical, but again, just listen to it. This is where things get really amazing in the body. So we've got nervous system coming in, stimulation, and the release of calcium comes out and disperses itself along the cell. And those two proteins, we're talking molecules of protein, actually get attracted to one another because calcium has been introduced. When the stimulation from the nervous system stops, another substance comes in called acetylcholine, and the muscles relax. This chemical reaction happening instantaneously. Every time I move something, this happens again and again and again. And so those proteins are in a row, become attracted to one another. What holds them in a row? A tube of connective tissue. Think about a straw for a moment. If we fill that straw with these two types of proteins, it gives a direction for them to move in. And so we take those cells, that's what a muscle cell is. It's a row of those two types of protein surrounded in a layer of connective tissue. And then you take a bunch of those cells, a bunch of those straws, you bunch them together, you wrap them with another layer of connective tissue. And then you take those bundles, that's called a fascicle, you take those bundles, put them together, wrap them one more time, and that's what we call a muscle. So if we go back to tearing a hamstring, what do you tear? Are you tearing molecules of protein? Absolutely not. You're tearing connective tissue at that point. So we're going to talk about a couple of different types of contraction, because normally we assume that a contraction of a muscle means that two bones move. But that doesn't actually always happen. Sometimes a contraction can happen and no movement happens at all. And we would call this stabilization. So I'm going to give you a really simple example of how we can feel stabilization happening in our own body. So I'm going to bring my wife onto the set for a second. If you can, grab a partner. If you don't have a partner available, you could place your hands just about on anything that's about shoulder height, and you could do it actually with one hand. It still works. And so what you'll do is, if that's the situation for you, one hand on whatever the structure is, and then one hand on your abdomen. So I'm going to place both of my hands on her shoulders. She's going to reach across and press her thumbs gently into my abdomen. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press my hands down into her shoulders. And as I do that, I feel my abdomen contract. And she feels my abdomen contract. And this is an example of the abdominal muscle stabilizing the torso so that my arms can push into a structure or a thing that it can't overcome. In other words, I'm never going to push her into the floor. And so as a result of that, my body is trying to stabilize my torso so my arm has the maximum amount of effort available to press down. If you continue to do this exercise and you close your eyes as you're pressing down on the other person's shoulders, you may also notice that you feel contractions actually below your waist, either the quadriceps or hamstrings, maybe even the calf muscles or into your feet. This is normal and continues the line of tension changing in order to stabilize the pelvis so that the ribs are stabilized, so that your shoulders have the maximum amount of ability to press into the other person's shoulders. There's 3 types of contraction that I want to introduce you to: isometric, isotonic concentric, and isotonic eccentric. If we look at the words and break them down for a moment, isometric means same length. ISO means same, metric refers to length. In an isometric contraction, the muscle actually contracts without it getting shorter or longer. I've got a 10-pound weight. If I hold that in my hand with the elbow bent to 90 degrees, you'll notice that the biceps is contracted, holding that weight, but there's no movement. The 2 other types of contraction, the isotonic concentric and eccentric, mean that the muscle actually changes length. Either it gets longer or shorter during the contraction phase of the muscle. Isotonic, broken down, ISO still means same. Tonic refers to tone. So what changes during an isotonic contraction is the length of the muscle. Either it's going to get shorter or longer during contraction. Isotonic concentric is one that everybody easily understands. And so if I hold this 10-pound weight in my hand again, we're going to look at biceps again. Its attachments are here on the radius and up here in the shoulder. Really, it has 2 attachment sites, but we'll just call it here for the moment. As I bend my elbow, flexing the elbow, contracting the muscle, in movement, you can see the biceps is contracted. The distance between radius and shoulder becomes less. Now in an eccentric contraction, I'm going to slowly lower the weight. And if you notice, as it moves down, my biceps muscle is contracting to slowly lower that weight down. The distance from radius to the shoulder becomes greater. So let me give you a practical place where we would use isotonic concentric, the shortening of the muscle during contraction, and isotonic eccentric, lengthening of the muscle during contraction. And I'm going to do a simple forward bend. So the first one we're going to look at actually is eccentric, because I'm going to fold forward. And as I do that, the pelvis rotates around the hip joint. And so as I start to fold forward, my hamstrings are actually holding onto my pelvis and slowly lowering it down. In other words, they're getting longer while they're contracting. If they stopped contracting, I'd fall forward completely. So now I need those hamstrings to contract and shorten in order to pull me back up. And so where they attach onto the sit bone here, as I come up, they're contracting and shortening and pulling me back up to a standing position. So one more time, this is eccentric contraction of the hamstrings as I fold forward. If I stop anywhere in the middle, it's now an isometric contraction. The muscle's contracted, there's no change in the length. If I continue on, this is still eccentric. I stop, isometric. As I come up, concentric contraction. If I stop anywhere in the middle, again, isometric until I'm back up to standing. And so when you look at the interaction of muscles in concentric and eccentric forms, basically you have to understand that a muscle never works alone. Never. It doesn't happen. It's pretty much impossible. And so part of our understanding of how muscles function comes from a very classic way of presenting muscles, where they attach, and the actions that happen, or the actions that they make us do. And that comes from standard teaching of kinesiology, which is origin, insertion, and action. The origin is the more stable bone, the insertion is the more movable bone. But these kind of lock us into understanding movement in a particular way. And the other thing is that it assumes that one is standing in anatomical position again. And we don't move, as we've already said, out from anatomical position and back to anatomical position. So we want to kind of get rid of that a little bit. So if you're familiar with the O, I, and A of origin, insertion, and action, let's let that go for a moment, although it has value in understanding the specifics of muscles. The more sophisticated way to describe this is just talking about muscles attaching. Maybe it's a distal attachment and a proximal attachment. And when you think about it that way, when a muscle contracts, if it's going to cause movement, it just causes those attachments to move towards one another. So let me give you a simple example of attachments moving as opposed to origin and insertion. Again, origin implies stable bone, it doesn't move. Insertion implies movable bone, it's never stable. So if I lay down on the floor, I'm going to lift my legs. And as I lift my legs, the movement, I'll lower them again, the movement itself is actually happening at the hip joint itself. Now the action, if we brought me back into anatomical position, would be flexion of the hip joint. So what group of muscles flexes the hip joint is the question. The number one wrong answer is the abdominal muscles. The abdominal muscles do not create movement at the hip joint. And the hip joint is where the femur meets the pelvis. The abdominal muscles don't cross it. Now they do work as stabilizers, and what they're stabilizing in this situation is the pelvis so that the femurs can move. So I'll do it one more time. Here's the hip flexors as a general group, which includes about 5 muscles, flexing my hip joints. My pelvis is stabilized. Okay? Hopefully you agree with me there. If I sit up, I've just moved at the same joint, the hip joint. I'm back into flexion at the hip joint. What muscles brought me up? The same exact group of muscles, the hip flexors of the body. The abdominal muscles contracted to stabilize my pelvis relative to my spine, but they didn't create movement at the hip joint. And so this is an example of origin and insertion basically switching. And so now you should have a much better understanding of how the muscles are formed, the functional potential of movement in the body, that is, that the attachment points between a muscle just move towards or away from one another. It doesn't matter which is considered more stable or more movable. The potential is there for them to move towards each other or away from each other. The nerves bring the impulses into the muscles, as we've already said. And when that happens, there's a whole process that goes on that may even get repeated over time. And the thing that I like to talk about in the nervous system is patterns of movement and how we create these patterns of movement in our own body. Have you ever seen a friend of yours walking 3 blocks away and you know them, you know it's them or you recognize them just by the way they move? That's an overall pattern that everybody has. We all have our own signature, our own way of moving. And these patterns come to us in a number of ways. I call these converging histories. The first one is spiritual, karmic. As a result, we might bring in certain things into our body as a result of perhaps past lives. The second way in which these comes in is through genetics. We inherit certain components of our body, such as tight connective tissue or loose connective tissue, or bone shape, which may limit or allow movement to happen. And so we get this genetic DNA makeup from our parents that also has a play in movement in our body. We also model after our parents. And so when we first learn how to walk, how do we learn how to walk? By looking at, by observing our parents moving and doing things. And it doesn't only come in the form of physical things. We also get and pick up mental patterns or ways of speaking or ways of thinking from our parents. And what always tends to happen is as we get older, or at least this is true for me, I slowly realize that I'm becoming my mother or my father. I'll say something and all of a sudden I realize, oh, that was exactly how my father would say something like that. As much as we try to fight it, certain elements we're always going to hold on to from our parents. The next history is any activity we've ever done. If you played soccer, martial arts, gymnastics, ballet, other forms of dance, all of those train our body to move in particular ways. And these all add and get layered onto our way of moving. Any injury you've ever had, it might be a result of some of those activities or maybe just simple accidents that have happened, all have an effect on how we move now. I've broken my femur, I've cut myself, I broke my collarbone. All of these things have some influence, some impact on where the bones are held, how tension happened around those injuries at that time. And so all of these combine together to give us our personal signature of how we move. Yoga is simply another pattern that we're going to lay on top of all of our existing patterns. So our patterns come right onto the yoga mat with us. Now these patterns through yoga also start to get taken away because yoga is a more balanced way of contracting and lengthening muscles, and we do things on both sides. And so as a result, we start to maybe take away some of these old patterns, tensional patterns in our body. And as I mentioned in connective tissue, as we start to do yoga, we lengthen, we warm our body, we lengthen the connective tissue, and some of these stuck areas that I've mentioned come out. Sometimes with those come emotional releases. That is, there may be traumas in the body that are held in perhaps the connective tissue or in the muscular system. And as we start to break up these patterns, they may get released. It may be laughing, it may be crying, it may be just raw emotion that has no specific attachment to any particular time or specific emotion, that is. It doesn't have to be anger or sadness or anything like that. The way in which these patterns get built up over time is through what I call facilitated pathways. And a facilitated pathway is simply a nervous system pathway that gets repeated over and over and over again. And we train ourselves to do all kinds of things in the same way. And driving a car is a perfect example of it. When you first learn to drive a car, you got to turn the radio off, you look in the side view mirror, you look in the rear view mirror. If you learned on a stick shift, then coordinating your hand movements to your clutch and the brake and the gas, all of these things have to come together and you have to be really present. You really have to focus on what you're doing. And then 6 months later, you hardly have to think about those things anymore. And so what you've done is you've created these patterns that basically as the nervous system feeds the muscles to do those particular movements, it goes into the spinal cord, up into the brain, gets processed, and then a response is given to that. But as you do it again and again, it doesn't actually have to go all the way up to the brain. It goes into the central nervous system, maybe as far as the spinal cord, and then a response is given back. And so it becomes a very quick response. And as a result, you can drive halfway across the city, brushing your hair, talking on the phone, drinking coffee, or any other number of things, and not even notice that you ran a red light or stopped at a red light. I know of one way in which you can get rid of these specific patterns in your body, and it's called general anesthesia. Although it may not be practical for you, when you go under general anesthesia, they shut the nervous system down to such a degree that all of these patterns essentially disappear. The tone of your muscle changes. It gets much softer. And so potentially anybody under general anesthesia could have their leg put behind their head, could be put into a really strong back bend or forward bend. And so it says something to how much activity we have going on in our nervous system all of the time, that when it gets shut down, we lose tone in our muscles. And as soon as that anesthesia wears off, that tension comes right back in. Those patterns will show right back up. Now, I don't think we could put together a class where everybody goes under general anesthesia and then we put them into yoga poses, although we could perhaps videotape it, and that way they would know that they did actually do it, although they might be sore the next day. But that's the only way I know. And the implications that I see for this is, when you're doing your yoga practice, how much nervous system stimulation are you giving? And it becomes that line of, how hard do I pull myself or push myself into a pose, and how much do I just relax and surrender to it? How much information do I need going on in my head? How many times do I need to be told how to do a yoga pose? At what point do you let go of all of that information? And so, to me, the more mental information you have going on in your mind, the more natural tension comes into the nervous system. So the nervous system becomes the mover of all of those other three components that we talked about of movement. So the nervous system comes in, gives a signal, the muscle contracts, the connective tissue is holding that muscle in place and connecting it to the bones and making movement happen. In the opposite way, when the nervous system isn't giving that stimulation, all of that tissue can be pulled apart. And so that brings together the skeletal system, connective tissue, muscular system, and the nervous system as the four components that create and allow for movement, or restrict it, in the body. Let's look at the foot in a little bit more detail. There are 26 bones in the foot and 30 bones in the entire leg. So 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. If we translate that into joints, there are 32 joints in the foot, 37 joints in the entire leg. So if we look even more closely at the foot, at those 26 bones, we find that the bones come in three segments, three groupings of bones. I don't want you to try to get caught up in learning the names of all of the bones, because they do have specific names. Let's keep it in sections. This group in the back of the foot, in the posterior section of the foot, are called the tarsals. Beyond the tarsals are what are known as the metatarsals. And if you look, there are 5 metatarsals. And beyond that are the phalanges, which make up the toes. If we look at the specific movements of the foot, the ankle actually is made up of 2 joints. At the first joint, which is where the tibia meets this bone, which is called the talus. So if we use our formula again, tibia plus O plus talus makes for the tibiotalar joint, is where we find the flexion and extension of the foot. Now this has a technical name. That is, this is called plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. The foot also turns inward and outward, which is similar to abduction and adduction. The movement inward is called inversion. The movement outward is called eversion. This sometimes gets mixed up with pronation and supination of the foot. Pronation and supination are similar movements, but incorporate movement of the entire foot. And so you normally use pronation and supination when talking about actual walking. So if we look at these movements in yoga poses, I'll give you a couple of examples. Let me put my leg down. If I go into a simple downward facing dog and you look at my foot, this is a dorsiflexed position of the foot and the ankle. This angle is dorsiflexed. If I go into an up dog, this is plantar flexion of the ankle. And so I move from plantar flexion to dorsiflexion. If I put a warrior in, I've now got a back foot that's inverted, that internal movement of the foot. And the last one, if I turn my feet out this way, and I go into a pose like this, the foot is now everted. If we look at the foot from an evolutionary perspective, there are 3 major changes that have happened. The first is we've lost a semi-opposable digit. So if you look at a primate and their foot or their back leg, They have a big toe that can help grasp things. So the toe has come in, and as a result, the second change is that the axis of the foot now sits directly through the second toe. And so you might have noticed that you have a second toe that's slightly longer. At least those of us on a more advanced stage of evolution do. So if yours is shorter, you're just a little further back. The third stage is a really important one that we're going to talk about, and that is the development in the arches of the foot. And I say arches plurally. Most people are familiar with the inside arch, and our word for inside is medial. So most people are familiar with the medial arch of the foot, but there are actually three. So if you look at the bottom of the foot, we'll play connect the dots for a moment. The calcaneus, that's the heel bone, the base of the big toe, and the base of the little toe create three lines that delineate the three arches of the foot. So this is the medial side, known as the medial arch. The arch on the outside is known as the lateral arch, and there's also an arch that goes across between the big toe and the little toe, and this is called the transverse arch. Effectively, when you stand or you put weight on your foot gets both longer and wider at the same time. This is why when you were young and you went to get your feet measured for shoes, you would always do it standing up because your foot gets longer and wider as you place weight on it. There's two words I want to introduce to you, and that is mula and uddiyana. And they refer to the bandhas in the body. The bandhas are the energetic valves or lock. The mula bandha is related to the pelvic floor and the root chakra. The uddiyana bandha is related to upward flying energy, upward movement of energy. And if we take that concept and apply it to our foot, the medial arch of the foot would be uddiyana. It's lifted, right? It comes up. The mula quality is the part of the foot that goes down, that is attached to the floor, that's connected to earth and rooting. And so in this microcosmic form, we want to balance out the qualities of mula and uddiyana. So in yoga, what's often talked about is engaging or lifting the arches of the foot. And the simplest way to do this is to lift the toes. Now, if you look closely at my foot, when I lift my toes, the tension of the tissues on the bottom of the foot have changed. If you look at this image of the plantar fascia, you'll notice that this layer of connective tissue runs from the very end of the toes over the ball of the foot, which is where the metatarsal meets the phalange, or the toe, and then down into the calcaneus, or the heel bone. And so as the toes lift, that piece of tissue will get stretched, and the heel and the base of the toe end up moving towards one another. And so by lifting the toes, I'm engaging the arch. Now, I can hold on to that because I'm also contracting the tissues in my foreleg. So if I hold on to that quality and that energy and place my toes down, I've got engaged tissues and an arch that is slightly lifted, as opposed to it being relaxed. So this comes in very handy in standing poses, because it's the standing poses that create our connection to earth, that root us to the ground. So the question is, what are the arches for? Outside of yoga, the arches create support, stability, balance, and the last one is actually adaptability. The foot has to change shape, even within our shoes. Our foot changes shape, and of course, when we first developed these feet, we certainly weren't walking around on sidewalks or hardwood floors or concrete. And so our foot had to be able to adapt to uneven surfaces and structures, and they still do it. In yoga, all of those same things apply. In our standing poses, they create strength and stability, support, resiliency, and therefore adaptability as well. So let's talk about the foot as a foundation. And this is important. Because of gravity's constant effect on us, weight travels down through our body. If our foundation isn't set right, then things above it tend to get out of whack. If you think about a house foundation, if the foundation settles unevenly, that big crack, the foundation is always going to settle. But if it settles and that crack happens and the floor on one side is ½ an inch to an inch higher on the other side, you're going to get a certain amount of tension and torsion running through that structure. The door may not open and close, it may need to be planed, or the windows will get stuck closed or stuck opened just as a result of that tension. The same thing can happen in our own body, whether this is just postural, and if I line myself up for a moment, if you look at, because I've got my own pattern going on, if you look at my feet, I put the inside of my feet parallel to one another. And you might notice that my right foot, this bone, is falling in a little bit more than it is on that side. If you then follow that up to the next joint, that is the knee joint, you'll notice that my kneecap on the right side is pointing in more than on the left. And if I bend my knee, it becomes a little bit more obvious. And so the foundation has fallen, the knee has turned in, and the hip also is therefore rotated in slightly. This also has implications further up in my body, into my shoulders. And if I think about where tension lies in my body, it's all around this particular pattern on the right side of my body. We all have different patterns like this, but this one is specific to being around the foot. There are 3 components that create and maintain the arches of the foot. The first one is quite simply bone shape. And so the way our bones are naturally formed creates an arch. Actually, when we're born, we're all born without arches. But they develop as we start crawling around and placing our toes on the floor and pushing off and moving backwards and forwards and crawling around. Our arches start to develop. But of course, some people do have flat feet. And so flat feet are generally a genetic thing if it's since the beginning. If you never remember having arches, then it's genetic. It is also possible for people's arches to fall later in life, usually due to a trauma or some type of injury. So the first component is bone shape. That's at the base of it. The second component is the tension of the ligamentous structures that knit and tie all of these 26 bones together. So it's about connective tissue. The connective tissue surrounding the foot, and we'll see this image on the screen, those small ligaments tie these bones together and hold them together. And the third component is the intelligent connective tissue. That's what I call muscles, or the myofascia. So the muscular tissue, the myofascia of the lower leg, crosses the ankle joint, comes down and attaches to various places in the foot, and through its normal natural tension helps maintain the arches. So when somebody does lose an arch, 80% of the time it's a result of imbalance between those tissues. The good news is, on that point, that you can change the myofascia, you can change the muscles, you can stretch it or strengthen it to create that balance and bring back arches that have fallen. Let's take this into a practical pose such as side angle. I'm going to bend my right knee to 90 degrees. A tendency in this pose is for a lot of the weight and energy of the pose to be forward. And what I find is people need to actually bring that back a little bit. So we're going to use what we know about the foot to make that happen. So as I fall into the pose, I'm going to lift my toes, which engages all of the tissues in the shin, and as a result of that, it creates downward pressure through my foot, the ball of the foot and the heel in particular. And it just supports my knee moving back ever so slightly. So from the foot to the knee, I'm going to take that and bring that quality or energy into my back foot. And now I'm going to lift the toes of my back foot for just a moment to feel the whole leg activate, and then put the toes back down. And now I'm going to use that line to create the line of my left arm. And so the downward moving of the right foot, the downward moving of the left foot takes it out into my hand. Even where we line up our feet in relationship to one another is going to make a difference to what happens above it. Because, of course, the feet are foundation for our standing poses. And it's very common for people to want to line the center of the back foot up with the heel of the front foot and take that in this direction. Now, depending on the person, that's going to have a very significant effect on the hips and how they can move. If you have very open hips and movable hips, this alignment may not be a problem. For those of you with tighter hips trying to square them to the front, try taking that back foot out, it could be the front foot out, and working with just a smaller amount of tension in the hips so that your pelvis can be facing straight forward. Even in a wide leg forward bend, the actual movement at the ankle is what we call inversion of the foot. And so you find this quite often in yoga. We actually want to do the opposite action to prevent too much of the first action. So we don't want the foot to collapse outward this way. So in order to prevent the inversion, what we're actually going to do is start to evert the foot, which means I'm going to press on the inner side and border of my foot. Another way to do that, quite simply, is, again, lifting the toes. And what that does is it puts pressure down into the base of the big toe, pulls the tissues underneath the foot nice and tight, and also puts pressure down into the heel. And that gives you a more even structure, because you could overdo this eversion as well. So again, this lifting the toes creates a downward sort of force through the bottom of the foot, and that quality comes upward through the legs, engaging the thighs. Even in a simple twist, the foot has significance. As I begin to sit back and twist, the foot actually can press down into the floor to increase the action of the entire leg. If I lift the toes up, it puts pressure downward and lifts my body upward. In my right foot, if I lift the toes up, reach out through the heel a little bit, it creates yet another line of energy moving out of my leg. With both together, you have a very active twist. And all of this together creates a very active twist. Let's make our way up to the knee, because the knee is actually